Well, hey there, everybody. Steve, the amateur historian. It's about 5:30 in the morning right now. In these times of quarantine, a regular sleep schedule doesn't exist anymore, and I really got the drive to do another episode in this series. And there's a lot packed into this case. The average story I do a video on is usually, maybe this many pages, 3 to 4 pages of information. Well, I got that, and I, just got another few more pages here, just like, 9 full pages of information to go over. So it's interesting that there's a lot to discuss, and I had the benefit of actually being able to see the actual files in relation to this case, which is very seldom are you able to do that as just a general vlogger. So I was able to go more in depth on things, and so that is this next case is one that takes us back to the late 1970s, at least when things started. And it's a case that to this day has not officially been solved, but actually, as of right now, present times, there is reason to hope and believe that maybe there will be a resolution to the case. It's funny, now that I'm doing this series where there's a lot of murders wrapped in mystery and delving into like John Doe and Jane Doe type cases, and it made me think, because it's funny, I did this film that I brought up from time to time, the Woman in the River documentary that I did a couple years back. The whole time I did it, because it's about a woman whose her remains were found scattered south of Portland in 1946. And the whole time I was doing it, I never thought of it as I was doing a documentary about a Jane Doe case, because it still hasn't officially been solved. They still don't officially know who the victim is. I obviously go very in-depth. Half my documentary is dedicated to who I think the victim is, and that might have distracted me a little bit. But I only recently, and then starting to study these cases and going into this series, that I actually realized that that documentary I did was actually really a documentary about a Jane Doe case. So this is kind of following along the same lines. And this particular case takes us back to 1978, at least when it was discovered. And this is the case of the Finley Creek Jane Doe. Now, the Finley Creek Jane Doe was a collection of buried human remains. It was actually technically two sets of remains, because after it was discovered, it was found that the remains that were found, it was all skeletal at this point. Whoever had died out there had been dead a long time. I always think how strange that is, to just die and be left out in the middle of nowhere, because this was in rural eastern Oregon, like 10, 15 miles from the nearest town. And think about you're just there. Obviously you're dead, you're not going to know, but you're just there all by yourself for Lord knows how long, until suddenly someone stumbles upon you. But the skeletal remains that were discovered were of a woman, but there was a collection of bones found, near her, where her uterus would be, and it was determined that the victim was probably 6 to 8 months pregnant with a baby at the time of her death, and the baby had died with her, unfortunately. But again, fortunately, I was able to get in-depth information. I took it all down in terms of what was actually discovered. Now, these remains were first discovered on August 27th, 1978, in an area that's generally known as Finley Creek. There's not really any town there, but that's kind of generally what the area is considered. And the remains were found relatively close to a road called Finley, I believe it was Finley Creek Road. I looked for that on Google Maps and couldn't find it. I was able to find a Finley Creek Lane, so maybe that's the same road with a different name. But the closest town to it was Elgin, I believe, which was a little ways east of there. So these remains were pretty far out there. And the only reason they were found is because they'd been deposited in an area that was a very popular place for hunters, and they were discovered by a couple of hunters that were out walking around. The remains had been buried in a shallow grave, but over time, animals had disturbed the grave. Some, bones were missing that obviously animals had, smelled the corpse and run off with parts of the body. But probably the combination of that and then just the combination of the passage of time and the weathering of the world, the skull of the victim had kind of risen above earth, so that had it all been still buried under there, who knows how long it would have been before the remains were found. But two hunters were out there and they found this skull, literally a skull poking up out of the ground, out there in the middle of their, the area that they went off into to hunt. I mean, I can't imagine being those people stumbling onto something like that and be just like, what the? There's just a human skull on the ground. So, of course, authorities were immediately contacted and they reported to the scene to analyze it all and, take all of the evidence that they could, because it was all skeletal remains. So they were definitely at the drawing board when this case took off. And it seems like there might be a little bit of, I mean, obviously you can narrow it down to a general area, but it is a little bit of a mystery as to the exact spot where these remains were found. Obviously, it's been referenced as being in the Finley Creek area. All the initial reports said it was found near where Ruckle Road and Finley Creek Road hit. And again, I found no Finley Creek Road. When I actually typed in just Finley Creek Road on Google Maps, it took me to a random spot along Ruckle Road. And again, the spot where it marked was just a little bit north of where Finley Creek Lane was. So somewhere in that general area. And I know one of the reports, and I think at least one newspaper said that the site was almost exactly 18 miles north of LeGrand, which puts you kind of right smack in that same area. So you've got a pretty decent sized general space to work with, but there's a general idea within probably about a couple hundred by a couple hundred square feet where exactly this victim was recovered. And again, I was able to see, these homicide reports and crime reports and typed out reports on what, individual officers saw when they went out there, and I made sure to take it all down because this is a rare opportunity. The first video I did was about a girl who left her home to go on a walk and then was never seen again. And that's really all we have to go on. Some cases you just have general information and a lot of mystery. In this case certainly has mystery, but you usually don't get to see this much in-depth detail. And, it's very, I as of a month ago, I'd never heard of this case before. I just started doing some research, and as you research this, it kind of leads you to this, and it's kind of a pinball effect. And I ended up landing on this case, and I was like, oh, this is like an Eastern Oregon Jane Doe case. That's really interesting. And then I discovered that literally as we speak, there's been like renewed interest in the case, and there's been like new investigative work going on. Literally recently, they only, I think a couple of months ago, finally created a visual, people like, especially for Jane Does or, victims that, they can't identify, they'll create a, well, probably used to be a sketch, but now they can actually do like computer animation because, well, it's 2020. And they just recently created, I think, like the first like computer rendering of what this woman probably looked like. Because again, it was all bones that were found out there. And one of the, as I was, sleuthing around and going into forums, one of the people that's involved in this actually posted all of these documents. So it's because of him that I even stumbled onto this stuff. So that definitely allowed me to go more in depth in this video. And here is essentially, this initial piece is all from a homicide report that was written, this was produced September 8th, 1978. Or at least that's when it was dated. So it's a little while after the case happened that this is officially dated, but it goes very in depth. and it describes the remains having been found in a forested area west of Ruckle Road. And I think some have said west and south because Ruckle Road kind of went a little diagonal in that area. So we at least know what side of the road the remains were discovered on. And what was recovered kind of near the surface was the skull, obviously, the spine and the ribs, which makes sense because that would be right, below the head, and the sacrum, which is a particular bone. It's kind of the bone that's in the middle of the pelvis. That was discovered near the surface, and these other pieces beside the skull were found east of what was described as an inclining hole of approximately 1 foot in diameter, which it was probably the ground was, seeping in because it was a grave was there. Bone pieces and cloth were found in a hole which had vegetation growing out of it. So a hole was there. It either had been, created by whoever did the crime, or, I don't know exactly how that would have been established. But yeah, there was a lot of references to like little pieces of cloth being found, and those could have been, old pieces of clothes from the body that, got ripped by, again, animals disturbing the grave site, weathering over time. It's hard to say. The jawbone was found with teeth near the skull. It wasn't still attached to the skull, so this lower part was removed, but still near it. North of the skull was red and white cloth was found. So again, more cloth. There was reference to zippers, plural, being found. So there was just a zipper by itself. Again, maybe from weathered away clothes. Maybe it was ripped off in a struggle. Who knows? And another section of the pelvis was also found in that area. Now, south of the skull, some more white cloth was found, 7 more ribs, and the scapula, which is shoulder bone, or the shoulder bone that kind of goes down your back here, that big bone, that's scapula. And then the humerus, which is upper arm bone, so the bone that's, right inside your arm here. I had to look both those up. I learned all that stuff in elementary school, but it's been a long time and I forgot. So that was kind of what was found along the surface, but obviously they knew there was more to be found underneath, so they dug up and excavated the site, looking for more bones, but also looking for more pieces of evidence, because obviously they didn't know who this individual was. So in digging and excavating the site, the further things that they discovered were, they determined that the grave that had actually been dug was approximately 4 feet long, 20 inches wide, and 27 to 29 inches deep. So you'd think like a grave for like almost like a, I don't know, like an 8-year-old child. But it was only not even 2 feet wide. So it was it's kind of long, short, and very thin. It's almost like something you'd put a doll into. So it's, I don't know, based on how small the grave was, whoever was out there either just didn't want to put in the effort to really hide the body, or they felt rushed. And it makes sense why part of the body was exposed, because it seems like putting a whole full-grown person into a grave that small, they were probably like crunched up, and eventually, you're probably going to unearth at some point. At the east end of the grave, there were the bone remains of both the legs, the feet, and another portion of the pelvis was found down there. So obviously when the body was put in, the head was facing a westerly direction, so the head was facing towards Portland, for reference, and the legs were facing towards, say, Idaho. That's how the body was buried. Now, she was still clothed. On the legs, there were size 15 to 16 pants that were of the brand Catalina. And they also maybe had been, had alterations done on them, and they were red pants as well. And she was also wearing shoes that, they weren't like full-fledged hiking boots, but they were like walking shoes, but like walking shoes that you'd wear when like you're going up into the hills, or you're doing some real serious walking, not like going out for a walk to the store or walking your dog in a park or something like that. Now at the north end of the grave, it says there was the lower half of an arm that may have been in relation to the humerus that was found earlier. That was missing some fingers. Again, likely animals picked at him and ran off with some. And there was also a bra, and then other pieces of white cloth were found at the base of the grave. So it seems like that was underneath them. So, you know, there's a lot of mystery. Nobody really knows exactly how this woman died. I mean, it was obvious that she was murdered, so to speak, unless it was somehow an accidental death, and then someone just decided that they would still have some heat on if they decided to, so that they just decided to bury the body and run off and hope nobody ever found it. But the fact that her bra was found underneath her, and it seems like her body was facing upward. She wasn't buried face down, at least as far as it seems. It seems strange that her bra, it seems, had been removed. You know, if she's buried and it's a full body, like, I don't know. I guess as the body decomposes, maybe the bra slipped down, but I don't know. That almost makes me wonder if there was some kind of sexual assault of some kind. I mean, I guess but she had her pants still on. Maybe she was assaulted in the pants. I mean, you know, there's a lot of things to speculate on because there's a lot of things we don't know. Now, toward the south end of the grave, opposite of where the arm and there was two sections. This is almost all we really have to go on in terms of like a possible murder weapon. Two sections of coaxial cable, which at least as we really know it today, coaxial cable is the cable that it doesn't really get used much now because now we have HDMI and things like that. But it's the coax cable is kind of regarded as the cable that you would plug into like older like tube televisions, and you'd have to you'd plug it into the back and have to actually screw it in. But yeah, two sections of presumably that kind of cable were found tied in a knot. And so, of course, it's theorized was that possibly used to, say, strangle the victim. One of the complications is because this victim had been dead for so long, they theorized that she'd been there at least a year, possibly more. They feel like the body was probably killed in 1975 or 1976, so, you know, with it being 1978, it had been probably 2 to possibly 3 years since this murder had happened. It's all bones. And the bones were actually in pretty good condition, and none of them were broken, none of them were battered. So it unfortunately creates a mystery as to how exactly this woman died. I mean, if you have a hole, you know, a noticeable, discernible hole in the side of the head that's here, and then there's one on the other side, you say, oh, she was shot in the head. At least we know that much about this victim. But there's no signs of any damage to the bones, blunt force trauma that may have occurred. Obviously, not all the bones were recovered, but because it was just these bones and none of the bones seemed damaged in any way, it's hard to say how this woman found her death. But the existence of this coax cable, especially out there in the middle of nowhere, what was somebody wandering in, you know, rural eastern Oregon walking around with coaxial cable, you know? And the fact that it was found there on the scene, like it was left there, and it was found at the south end of the grave. So I don't know if it was found near the legs or more near where the head would be. And it also says that they checked with a detector to see if there was any metal to be found. You know, and possibly like maybe if a gun was buried or anything. They didn't find any metal. So this was, you know, this was a very you know, kind of I mean, it's good that after all this time in such a rural place that these remains were found. But really, at the end of the day, all we had, I guess the general we, was a bundle of bones with no identity to put to them. They did know that the woman was pregnant, which at least was hopefully could be of some assistance. And obviously, you know, authorities, you know, once they had these remains, they started inquiring in the investigation, like, you know, has anybody seen, you know, any women in that area who looked noticeably pregnant? But for what little there was to actually identify the victim, at least the bones that were recovered were able to provide a template as well. In addition to the fact that this woman was clearly pregnant, we were able to generally determine her overall stature. And it was figured, initially they thought she may have been an older woman. And I want to say there was at least one elderly woman who was in her 70s who vanished from her home and hadn't been seen in several years, and they contemplated very briefly that she might have been this victim, but once the bones were analyzed, it was deemed that the victim was between 17 and 25 years of age at the time of her death. Meaning whoever the victim was, she probably was born, early 1950s to possibly late 1950s at the latest. And she was a white female, approximately 5'1" to 5'3", and weighed roughly probably about 115 to 125 pounds when, she was alive. They determined she'd had light brown and blonde hair, and I think they even found little hairs in the area that matched that color. And again, it was also estimated that she was potentially 6 to 8 months pregnant. So there was very little to go on. And I know one of the first leads that police got was a very strange call that they received from someone who wouldn't identify themselves. It was anonymous. It was very cryptic. It was like, you should look into this by. And they said that they should look into a woman named Tina Bradford, who apparently was pregnant and was living in the McMinnville area, which McMinnville is a little ways west of Portland and quite a long ways from where these remains were recovered. And someone said that this woman had been living in McMinnville and had been traveling with a guy named Paul Womack. And it was considered that possibly this Paul Womack guy might have been the perpetrator in her death, and thus this Tina Bradford may have ended up being this victim. Now, authorities looked into that story with what little information they'd been given. They contacted McMinnville. They tried to get any information about any Tina Bradford that had lived there, was living there, anything they could get, addresses, high school, if she went to high school there. And there was never any information uncovered about a Tina Bradford who'd been living in McMinnville. And, I ponder. Again, we don't know who the victim is, so there's room to ponder for a number of these instances. Now, if this Tina Bradford was, if she even exists, if she was living in McMinnville, was she actually residing there? Because I know, especially in the 60s and 70s, people, especially young people, they bounced around a lot. They live in this town for 3 months. They live in, is it possible this Tina Bradford could have recently relocated to Oregon and was just staying with some friends in McMinnville but hadn't established a real address there and thus didn't actually have an official presence in Oregon and maybe could have ended up being this victim? I mean, who knows really at this point, but based on the information that was given, there was no way to verify that this Tina Bradford even existed, so it was quickly dismissed as a possible victim in this case. And one of the next things of, I guess you could say, interest was a area that had clearly been used as some kind of a campsite shelter area was discovered along one of those many kind of dirt gravel roads that kind of roam through the hills all over eastern Oregon. At the end of one of these roads, I want to say it was Route 541, authorities discovered the remains of a shelter, people had set up camp out there in the wilderness. And this was located, I think, only a couple miles north of where these remains were found. And by the time this little campsite had been found, it had clearly been abandoned. Nobody was there. There was more just kind of remains of the shelter there as opposed to a fully functioning shelter. And it was very bizarre because it was abundantly clear that it seemed like another grave had been buried there. It was obvious the ground was softer, it had been disturbed, and it had been dug up, and probably something had been put in there. But when they dug it up, and it was a pretty decent-sized hole, it was several feet by several feet, they found an abundance of items. A lot of them kind of military themed. They found military-type clothes. They found a military-style canteen for drinking out of. They found military shoes, but they also found They found food, like canned food that was still good to eat. Like they found a bunch of clothes for both men and women. And they also found like feminine hygiene products. They found a bunch of maxi pads in there. So it was obvious that whoever was staying at this shelter, at least one of those people was a woman. And here this is located just a couple miles north of where these remains were found. So it was thought that possibly there was a connection between that discovered site and these remains, and that possibly whoever the woman was that was there, she might have ended up being this victim. And it's interesting when you discuss a potential campsite, because one of the other interesting things about the way that the victim was found, the area around it, because again, other than some cloth and this coaxial cable, there wasn't really a whole lot of other evidence besides the remains themselves. But something that was noticed, again, while on the subject of campsites, there was a lot of wood, like wood that seemed to have been, it didn't just like land there naturally, and it wasn't just branches and sticks, but it was like wood pieces were found around the gravesite, and burnt wood was found in the grave with the body, which was interesting because it didn't seem like, because you find burnt wood mixed in with human remains, and you think potentially the body was set on fire. But there was, again, the bones were in good shape. They showed no signs of fire damage. I've never seen anybody suggest that this victim had been burned anywhere, and yet there was these burnt pieces of wood mixed in with the body's remains, and there was no wood like that to be found anywhere else around that discovery site. Very strange. And one of the only real pieces of evidence they had to go on, I'm going back to the shelter that was found close to the body discovery site. They found a jacket that said Nisqually Eagles on it. So probably like a sports jacket of some kind. And Nisqually is a town that's located really close to Olympia, Washington, kind of in between Olympia and Tacoma. So there was an effort to maybe to look through that neighborhood and to see if maybe somebody was missing, to see if somebody recognized this jacket so that it could be tied to somebody. And I unfortunately don't think that went anywhere. But there was a local family there that apparently one of their relatives had reportedly gone missing. Her husband, the woman's husband, had said she'd been missing for a couple of years. So, of course, interesting. Someone's wife's been missing for a couple of years. We have this body that's been likely buried for at least 2 years. But it was later found out that that wife was alive and well, just pretty much on the other side of the country. And apparently they'd had a divorce. So it seemed very strange that this guy was suddenly reporting his wife as missing when they were in the process of getting divorced. And, it was another one of those, kind of pointless leads that didn't go anywhere. As was the case with this discovered campsite. Like, it was interesting. Maybe the two were connected, but there was no way for certain to tell. And there were a boatload of potential suspects, potential victims, and unfortunately, none of them, as far as we can tell, have panned out. Again, did Tina Bradford even exist? We don't even know. Maybe she's the victim, but somehow I kind of doubt it. But even within like 2 months of the case, there was one of the police reports I saw, there was references to 4 women to look into. There was a Lori Lynn Partridge, who'd been missing since late 1974, a Marie Elizabeth, I think it's Spanaki, who'd been missing since the start of 1976. Rita Lorraine Jolly was actually, and when I took these notes before I looked into that case. I had no idea I was going to be looking into that case, which that was my first episode, was looking into her case. I had no idea that they had actually considered her as possibly being this victim. I mean, she would have been about the right age. She disappeared in 1973. At the age of 17, they said the victim was 17 to 25 years old. So, I mean, maybe it's her, but since she disappeared like 5 years before these remains were discovered, and it seems like they think it'd been more like 2 to 3 years, There's also nothing to suggest that Rita Jolly was pregnant, as this woman was. I mean, again, whenever she vanished, it's likely she was killed not long after. And if she was 6 to 8 months pregnant, it would have been in the information. It would have been known. So no, I don't think she's the victim. And then a Laura Lee Flink, who'd been missing since 1969, which you're going back almost a decade. These were women that were suggested being looked into, and I think they just kind of lingered on as unsolved cases. So it's not known if any of these other women maybe were the victim. And then you go to April 1981. There was a woman named Melanie Flynn who had vanished from Lexington, Kentucky. They were contacting all the way to Oregon to see if maybe, because this was a young woman who seemed to have left town and vanished. And she had her dental work compared to the teeth of the victim, of the Finley Creek victim, and it was found that their dental records didn't match. And see, this was one of the few benefits in discovering these remains with little to go on, was they did find the jawbone with the teeth and the skull with the teeth, and they were actually able to analyze the teeth and found that these teeth were all pretty much natural, and there was fillings in some teeth kind of off to the side. So she had very distinct dental work done that would be very easy to compare and contrast. Anybody who came along, they could pretty much determine whether or not they were the victim just based on these dental records. And Melanie Flynn's teeth didn't match, so she wasn't the record. And this was a succession of multiple people that were dismissed based on the dental records. And there was actually 2 people from Colorado that were suggested as possibilities. In October 1981, there was a woman named Lori Clausen who went missing. And I think they checked and she didn't match. And then there was a, who was the next one? Again, there was so many. And as we move toward the later 80s, 7, 8, 9, 10 years after this case, or after these remains were recovered, they were finding computer matches. Obviously, what information was known about her was being put into a system, and that was being spread around to see if it possibly connected with someone. Who was somebody who was 17 to 25 years old, possibly pregnant, although I don't think that would be a super defining factor, and who'd been missing since, like the mid-1970s. And 2 of them came up in the late 80s. In March of 87, there was a possible ID used in this computer information of a woman named Desiree Haas, who'd been missing from Placerville, California, which is just east of Sacramento, kind of central California. And her dental work was sent up and it didn't match with the victim, so wasn't her. And then a year later, March 1988, another missing person from California, a Sherry Pickle, who had been missing from Covina, California, which is kind of an east suburb of Los Angeles. They were able to dismiss her pretty quick. She'd been missing since 1977, and she'd had no dental work done. She had all original teeth. So immediately, we knew she wasn't the victim. So it was just this long list of possibilities coming and going, and just, unfortunately, none of them worked. The dental work dismissed all of them. And obviously another angle they had to work with was, again, this victim had been pregnant, so her final weeks, anybody who would have seen her would have noticed that she had, a large stomach, that she would have been pregnant with a child. Again, she was almost on the verge of giving delivery, it seems, at the time of her death. And there was really only one thing I noticed in the documents that actually suggested possibly being the victim, and again, it seems like it was another dead end. In December 1988, some women had been doing work, planting trees, like agricultural work, kind of helping beautify the landscape. And they had said that they had been working with a woman. Now, this was in the spring of 1977. So this is about 14, 15 months before the discovery of the remains. And they'd been working with a woman who was very pregnant by their description. And this organization had been planting trees near a small town called Troy, which is in Wallowa County, next county over, going east from Union County, which is where these remains were found. And Troy is only about 60 miles away from where the body was discovered, so not that far away at all. And fortunately, because it was an actual organization, they actually, kind of kept track of things, and they narrowed it down to they had only one woman that they knew of who was pregnant. And again, 6 to 8 months, that's a pregnancy you're going to notice. So they were able to narrow it down to one person. So, maybe this is a break, maybe this is a lead. And it was a woman that they knew as Chris Wetland. That's how they knew her. And in research, it was found that there was a woman named Mary Christine Wetland, who lived in Washington and who gave birth to a baby in September of 1977. So, just a couple months after, some workers were working with a woman who was pregnant, a woman who her middle name matches the first name and the last name is the same. She was obviously alive and well because she gave birth to her child in 1977, more than a year before the remains of this victim were discovered. So again, they thought maybe they had something. And unfortunately, it was just another dead end, and that was all that could be. That's all that happened in this case for the, really the 12 years that there was work into it, because, and this is what really pisses me off, is in 1990, it had been only 12 years since these remains had even been found. And again, there were computer hits in 87 and 88, recent years. It's been just over a decade since these remains were found. The decision was made officially to close the case after 12 years because they hadn't had any identifications and it didn't seem like the case was going anywhere. So they closed the case down and called for the destruction of all of the evidence. 12 years! And they'd already given up on this case. This was an unsolved murder case. It wasn't just the unsolved murder of a woman. It was kind of the unsolved murder of her child because, it seems likely that this woman was planning on having a baby. So I don't understand how you bail. And I understand this was Eastern Oregon, but I don't even think it was just the local authorities. I think it was like state authorities. They just all kind of just decided the hell with it. Which is something I will never understand. If this is a cold case and you have evidence, I don't care if it's 50, 60, 70, 80 years later, you hold on to all of that evidence because you never know when you're going to need it. What if a potential victim came up in 1992 and they suddenly don't have that evidence to look at, and that really is the victim, but you're never going to know because you don't have the pertinent things you need to actually make that identification happen, like the jawbone and things like that have the actual teeth on them. Like, yeah, they took down dental record information, but I will never understand getting rid of all the evidence in cold cases, especially a cold case that was barely a decade old. Like, this was still it was a cold case, but it was still fresh compared to, really old cases that are 100 years old. So that was a horribly just deplorable, reckless, just downright ignorant thing to do. And I was reading some of the comments. Some people think because once that was established, like, we're going to destroy the evidence, the idea was that these bones were taken and cremated and put somewhere, but it seems nobody knows where the remains are. Nobody knows whether they were cremated and then cast to the winds like what people tend to do with remains. Nobody knows if they're sitting in an urn in a building somewhere or what. And the idea is that they were just destroyed and just everything's gone now. So just forget it. Just move on with your lives. A woman died and was buried in the desert. Who cares? It was over 40 years ago. Move on with your life. And of course, I hate the way that people dismiss cases and say that a missing person's case isn't important anymore because it happened such and such a long time ago. I don't subscribe to that. I mean, pretty much all the cases I'm discussing in this series are, for the most part, the newest cases I cover are from the 80s. So we're talking things that happened 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago. I have a case I'm looking into from 1912 that, as far as I can tell, was never resolved. Doesn't matter how long ago it happened. These were people's lives. The disappearance of someone 50 years ago is as important as the disappearance of someone that happened 50 days ago. So that's my rant. It's disgusting that they decided to give up so early on. But there are some people, I was reading in the comments, who think that their remains are somewhere and they can be found. It's just a matter of figuring out where they are. Because it's possible now, and this is another thing that's disgusting, is by 1990, DNA, it was still, a young thing, but it was happening at that point. It was obvious that this was going to become an identification tool, a significant one to be used in the future. And even then, even with that beginning to happen, they still just got rid of these remains that could have potentially had DNA extracted from them. Even potentially the ashes, or whatever state the remains are in, if they could be found, it's maybe possible that DNA could be extracted from them still. And then you actually have something that can genuinely be compared to other people, and you're not just relying on the dental records anymore. But till these remains are recovered, and thanks to their actions back in 1990 to get rid of these remains in the first place, that may never happen. And now, of course, without an identity to go to the victim, it's nearly impossible to say who the perpetrator is or what exactly. Again, we don't even know exactly how this woman was killed, so it's hard to even theorize about who did it, what the circumstances were around it. And of course, with at least being theorized that this victim was killed 1975, 1976, roughly. And I said this was going to happen in this series. Of course, names like Ted Bundy and Gary Ridgway and the likes of that come about. Pretty much anything that happened in the 1970s in the Pacific Northwest missing persons case, Ted Bundy is going to pop up at some point. So it is theorized. Now, of course, Ted Bundy did kill, well, he's officially killed one woman in Oregon, but in one source I saw, apparently he admitted he either didn't know their names or didn't want to give their names, but he admitted to killing like at least 2 more women in Oregon. So he'd been through Oregon a couple of times. And, both him and Gary Ridgway would kind of, Gary Ridgway was much more about, obviously he was called the Green River Killer because he would go out in the wilderness and, a lot of his early victims were deposited near the Green River. It seemed as time went on, Ted Bundy would tend to just kind of murder his victims in bail. Whereas Gary Ridgway would more like deposit them in more rural areas, kind of like where these remains were being found. But again, these guys predominantly worked out of Washington. And it's important to realize that most of Ted Bundy's kills in the Pacific Northwest, Washington and Oregon, were done in 1974, and I think a little ways into 1975. If the victim had been there maybe a little bit longer, I could see Ted Bundy doing that. I know that in the years to follow, he spent a lot of time in Colorado and Utah and Idaho, and he could have passed through Eastern Oregon a time or two and maybe picked up a victim. But again, he tended to just kind of leave them. And he would, like, if there was wilderness nearby, like the Lake Sammamish, 2 girls at the lake, I think he actually, but even then, he didn't really do a very good job of hiding them. And a lot of his victims, he'd kill them and kind of leave, especially if he was attacking them in their home or in some room or in his car, he would just kind of leave them somewhere. He wasn't really super invested on hiding his victims. So the fact that, a grave was dug for these remains, the fact that these remains were buried in a very rural area, doesn't really match well with Ted Bundy. And, the fact of where these remains were deposited, I feel like whoever did it was either somebody who was from the area, who knew the area really well, and thus, knew their way around and knew that they could get to an area like this. and felt like that would be a logical place to bury a body and hopefully it wouldn't get found. So I feel like it was either somebody who knew the area well, or it was, people who were hitchhiking, people who were, again, this campsite that was found a couple miles away. They were people that were maybe just traveling along and kind of just staying out in the wilderness and, making their way, who just happened upon that area. And then, however this murder went down, it did. And the individual that did it, maybe she was murdered in the vicinity of where she was buried, which seems logical. It wasn't like along the side of the road where you could have just like killed him, driven him to a spot, and kicked him out of the car onto the side of the road. The body was I think it was like 200 yards off the road. So wherever the body was murdered, it would have had to have at least been dragged from the street a long ways where it was put. It could just be that the, murder happened in that area, and whoever did it was like, well, I'm going to dig a grave here, and hopefully nobody ever finds this. And whoever did it then, went their merry way. And of course, because the remains were discovered so far long after this victim had died, that there's no real eyewitnesses. Like, oh, did you see an interesting man walking down the street on April 3rd, 1975? Who's going to remember anything like that? And the fact that it was so rural, they said the closest house was like 5 miles away. Even if whoever did this was loitering in that area, it's unlikely they would have been seen by anybody. And if they had been seen by anybody, it wouldn't necessarily be of suspicion because they'd be so far removed already from where this victim was buried. I mean, it's just no simple resolutions. But because of how it was, the fact that it was very rural, that the body had been taken off the road and actually the time had been taken to get buried, I don't think it really matched that well with Ted Bundy. And he was more in the Utah, Colorado area by the time that they really think the murder actually happened. So I doubt it. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I doubt that Ted Bundy was the killer. Now, the style being put in the middle of nowhere and, kind of at least somewhat buried, it definitely matches much closer to Gary Ridgway, who would take his victims to rural areas. He would kind of bury some of them. But, when you have a victim that you think died in the mid-1970s and you have Gary Ridgway, who, again, we can't say for sure when his first killing ever occurred. I know I have to pull up my notes. But yeah, in the case of Gary Ridgway, officially he started killing people around 1983. But it's suspected that he had killed victims as early as 1980, which doesn't really help our case, but it shows that he, usually the first official murder that you can attach to a serial killer, odds are it's probably not actually their first murder. But there was also it says in the information I found about lists of people Gary Ridgway actually killed, as well as people he's suspected of killing. And he's suspected of killing a Jane Doe who wasn't found till 2001, but they feel she could have died as early as 1973. So if that is the case, and again, that's a long stretch. It could have been anywhere between 1973 and 1983, pretty much was what they were saying. It's a long stretch to say that just because there's maybe a victim that he killed in the 70s, maybe, it can't even be proven, that he was responsible for this crime. And, he buried some victims in Oregon, but pretty much all of the victims, any victim that he killed who was from Oregon or any victims he got rid of in Oregon, it was all around the Portland area. It never really was, he never really was out Eastern Oregon way. So it's a little too early, I think, and it's not really an area that I feel like Gary Ridgway would go to. So, you do have to, it's where you get, it's, all the big pomp is, the big serial killers must have done it, but I don't think Ted Bundy or Gary Ridgway were necessarily guilty of this one. Now, there is another guy who, again, I'm very skeptical that he was guilty, and he's this, and also because he killed a lot of other people in other states, but he was apprehended in Oregon, so he's kind of considered an Oregon serial killer. And he was this guy named Bobby Jack Fowler, who was killing people, women, some young, but from 1969 to 1995. So and a lot of his victims were hitchhikers and people just kind of wandering along who needed a ride. And I think some people have even contemplated if John Aykroyd, who is, he's gotten a lot of attention in recent years. He was the subject of an extensive newspaper piece, Ghosts of Highway 20. They have like a 2-hour documentary on YouTube where they interview the people, and essentially this John Aykroyd guy worked a highway going back and forth from the beach, and he it's thought that he picked up random women from here and killed a bunch of them. He's thought to have killed his 13-year-old stepdaughter. And his first known victim who survived, but who he attacked and almost killed, was in 1977. So it's pretty close. However, John Aykroyd was more known for lingering in the southern. He went along Highway 20, pretty much between the southern edge of the Willamette Valley and the middle of the Oregon coast around Newport, which interestingly, Newport is where Bobby Jack Fowler was finally apprehended in 1995. And so there's kind of a correlation between these guys, because the victim, a lot of their Oregon victims or perceived Oregon victims were people that were killed kind of near the Oregon coast, which that's way over on one side of Oregon. Meanwhile, you got Eastern Oregon where these remains were found that are way on the other side. So I don't think at all that it was John Aykroyd, but Bobby Jack Fowler is a possibility. Now, granted, it's, most of his Oregon, at least his known Oregon victims, were killed in the 90s, so quite a while later, but his actual first kill, his first known kill, is all the way back in 1969. And he's still, he's under suspicion for multiple Oregon missing persons and murder cases that haven't been solved from, going back to the start of the 80s, which is pretty close. So he's a possibility. Another person that I don't think is the killer. I mean, we always want to believe that these cases where, you find the remains of somebody and you don't know who it is and it's a big mystery, you want to believe that it's some big presence that was involved, but it honestly could have just been two people wandering in the wilderness. Nobody knew they were out there. Even their family would have had no idea where they were at the time. Something happened. The woman in the case died, and the guy buried her and wandered off, and it was just two random, everyday people. We don't know their names. We may never know who they are. It's much more likely that it's something like that than the idea that it was a big, prominent serial killer. And one more person of real suspicion, or actually two more, technically. I saw, and this was very interesting because now you're getting down to more, actually, honestly, more likely suspects, because these are people that have a history of, a dark history, a criminal history, who actually lived in the general vicinity, kind of Eastern Oregon, Idaho. They lived kind of near the area at the time that it seems like this murder occurred. And one that I found referenced on a few like blog sites and was able to find a little information about him was a guy named Harry Hatman. Now, Harry Hatman was put into a mental asylum all the way over in Washington, D.C., on the other side of the country. It was deemed he was a lunatic after he raped an 11-year-old girl. And he actually managed to escape, and he fled, and he actually, he escaped on Christmas Day, 1973, and he actually managed to stay free for 20 years. But by the 1970s, he actually had settled in Eastern Oregon, of all places, which makes sense. He was living under an alias, and he'd done such a good job posing as another person. He actually did time in an Oregon prison, and they had no idea that he was this guy that had, this rape record and who was supposed to be in a mental asylum in Washington, D.C., because they thought he was genuinely this other guy. He actually did time in Oregon, and they thought he was a whole other person. Of course, that was also for a sexual assault. So this guy was, a serial rapist. And, a lot of serial rapists, they'll graduate to murder afterwards, especially if they get sick and tired of getting busted. And this guy was deemed insane. But he ultimately ended up living in rural Wallowa County. And he was finally tracked down in 1993. He escaped in 1973, caught in 1993 in Lewiston, Idaho, which Lewiston, Idaho was right across the border from Washington, so a little further north from where this case occurred. But he had, I have to find the town. He lived really close to Joseph, Oregon, so about 60 miles roughly from where the body was discovered. He lived in this area for a very long time. And he probably got to know that rural Oregon area really well. And I found even as he was being apprehended, he was being looked into for the kidnap and rape of a Japanese foreign exchange student. Like, this guy was nuts. And here's a transition, because this Harry Hatman, it's a very interesting name, he was also being considered, and I'm going to do a video in this series on this case, so I don't want to get too in-depth into it. But Harry Hatman also became under suspicion as the individual is known as the Lewis and Clark Valley serial killer, who is someone that has been deemed responsible for at least 5 deaths, 3 people that did die and 2 people that have disappeared and are presumed dead, that lived in the vicinity of Lewiston, Idaho, which is where Harry Hatman, oddly enough, was finally apprehended. And so again, he ultimately was living in Lewiston, but he was living in Eastern Oregon near there, so he came under suspicion as this other serial killer. And it's pondered if possibly whoever the Lewis and Clark Valley serial killer is, maybe, I mean, if you had to ask me honestly, I don't think it's the same person. Since all these victims disappeared from areas that were very in and around Lewiston, which is still a little ways away from where this victim's remains were found. But because of the theorization, because the first known victim of the Lewis and Clark serial killer, Valley serial killer, which again I don't want to get too much into, was killed in 1979. So just a couple of months after this victim. And again, when you're a serial killer and you've killed multiple people, who knows again when you actually first started killing people. But because the idea kind of started coming up that maybe the Lewis and Clark Valley serial killer is the person that killed this woman whose remains were found in the desert, most of the victims of the female victims that were killed by the Lewis and Clark, or at least are presumed victims of him, were women, I guess you could say girls to women between the ages of like 12 and 21. So this murder victim, the Finley Creek Jane Doe, was, probably late teens, early 20s, so kind of fit the age gap. But again, because it was kind of being theorized that maybe she was another victim, that made people start looking into a guy by the name of Lance Voss. And Lance Voss is a very interesting specimen. It seems like wherever he moved, there was a murder happening, or multiple murders happening. And he's been under suspicion for a long time as being the Lewis and Clark Valley serial killer. And because that, some people theorize if he maybe was whether he was that guy or not, that maybe he was the killer of this Finley Creek Jane Doe. He lived predominantly through the 70s. He lived kind of on the western edge of Idaho. He lived, I think he lived near Moscow, and at one point was living in Lewiston. He was, I know he owned a couple houses, I think some just right across the Idaho border into Washington. So he was still, that was kind of primarily where he was residing. So, I mean, he wasn't too far away when this murder happened. So it's worth, some brief contemplation whether he maybe is the killer of this victim. But again, when we don't have an identification, we don't know who the victim is, how are we going to narrow down who the killer is? You can't, unfortunately, in this case. So, we can go on all day about potential suspects, but really it's just a lot of theorization and just kind of beating your head on the wall, hoping it leads to something. But really, you know, the only thing that's going to lead to resolution on this is hard work and hopefully a little bit of luck. And it really, you know, because again, I had no idea this case existed, you know, a couple of weeks ago. And then, of course, I start looking into it and I find that currently, right now, this is actually kind of a big case that's being rejuvenated and being, you know, looked back into by some people. And it's just a coincidence that I stumbled upon the case right in the middle of that, which enthralled me and pushed upon me even more to do a video in this series about this case. And unfortunately, where we stand right now, for about 42 years later, it's still unsolved, but there's still people trying to find the truth, which is all you can ask for. I have the utmost respect to the ceiling for people who will put this much dedication into finding the truth about something that you could spend 30, 40, 50 years looking into something and still never resolve it. But you still do it because you feel it's something that needs to be resolved. It's something that should be resolved. This is the life of a human being that was snuffed out. And just because we're still a little bit at the drawing board right now in terms of what actually happened and who this woman actually is. Again, you know, only recently an artist's rendition of the woman was made. That's progress, small though it is. You know, I have the utmost respect for people that will put this much into discovering the truth, hopefully, about some random person they never even knew, never met, never knew. May have just been another random person who just, you know, never really did much in life and just hitchhiked around and just didn't really lead that grand of a life. But their identity still deserves to be discovered and proven and finalized, which apparently was too much for law enforcement to do because they bailed after 12 years. And now it's up to whoever else wants to get involved to actually, you know, resolve this case and find out who the Finley Creek Jane Doe actually is. And I really hope we find out someday, because there's been so many potential victims, so many close calls, and they've all just not panned out. I hope the ashes are still somewhere, and I hope DNA can be taken from them, because that will be monumental in hopefully finding a resolution to this particular case. That's all I can hope for in all these cases, and that's why I'm doing this series in part, is because you have a lot of people who have gone unidentified or not received justice for what happened to them, these horrible murders that people have had to suffer, and they deserve justice. And justice in this case is a resolution as to who this victim actually is. So I'd like to thank you guys so much for watching this video, sticking with me through the whole thing. It's a pretty long one. Again, it's a lot of information. As always, remember to like, share, subscribe, hit up my Patreon if you want to help me out that way. And until next time, everybody, from my home in quarantine, it's probably about 6:30 in the morning now. I need to go to bed. So, Steve the Amateur Historian, I'll see you later.